Hey Benny, here's my video on bread baking. We're starting off in our garden here in Bethel. There's Kim. She's very pregnant right there. And I go to the garden to check on my wheat that I'm growing for my bread. Um, it's planted in June, and usually we harvest it in September or October. And so what I do is you can see the wheat there, about one row in. There I am, going over to the wheat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break out one of what's called the wheat berries. And the wheat berries are what flour comes from. So you can see on each of those stalks is a bunch of wheat berries that are in a husk. And so I'm taking that wheat berry out of the husk and I'm pinching it in my fingers to see if I can dent it with my fingernail. If I can dent it, then I know that the wheat is not ready and it needs to dry longer. It needs to stay longer. So, all right. So we're going to cut over to our kitchen in Anchorage because I'm in Anchorage right now. We're waiting for the babies to be born. And so we're in this apartment and I haven't been here before. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to bake some bread. So the first thing I usually do is I kind of clean up a little bit and get things ready for baking. And I'm going to be baking a kind of a special bread. It's a little bit more complicated. And also, as a warning, this video is a little long. I've never done this before. I've never tried to film myself doing something, and it's pretty hard to do. I challenge you to try to do it sometime. It's you have to really think it out and think about what you're gonna film. I wanted this video to be like 5 minutes long. It's not 5 minutes long. So if you need to watch it for 5 minutes and then take a break, I totally understand. All right, so what I'm doing right now is I'm getting a buble out of the refrigerator. This is not a part of bread baking, but it certainly helps. Okay, so I'm getting the ingredients. I'm getting the tools I'm going to need. So what we have right there is I'm getting some bowls down. I'm getting the yeast, and I'm checking my recipe. I do this a lot. Even though I've baked a lot of loaves of bread, I still use recipes. Sometimes I change them, but I usually start with a recipe. And I look at the time, so it's 6:23 in the evening. So this is the night before I bake the bread. All right, so I've got my ingredients, my whole wheat flour. Usually I make my own flour from wheat berries, but since I don't have a mill here, I'm just going to be using some store-bought flour. Um, and I've got my bowl and I've got my yeast there. And what I'm going to be doing now is using this cup to measure out the flour. Now, here again, usually I have a scale. I really recommend that you get a scale for your kitchen if you don't already have one. They're super helpful in being accurate in baking. All right, so since I don't have a scale, I'm using this measuring cup and I'm putting the flour into this big bowl, which is where I'm going to be mixing all of my ingredients together. But here's the thing. With this special recipe, I'm only mixing some of the ingredients together on the night before. It's something called a poolish, kind of a funny word, Poolish. And it's what is considered a pre-ferment. So you're mixing a little bit of yeast, some water, and some flour together the night before, and you're letting it sit and sort of bubble up during the evening, overnight, and that creates a richer flavor in the bread that I'm going to bake. All right, so I'm getting the flour together still, and I can send you this recipe if you're interested in trying it as well. All right, and next I'm going to be getting the yeast, drinking some buble, of course, and getting the yeast. Wait a second, what am I doing? I'm looking for a, what am I doing? A rubber band? Yes, I'm looking for a rubber band so that I can seal the flour. You don't want to leave flour out, it goes bad. And so I'm sealing up this is whole wheat flour from the store. I don't like it as much as fresh milled flour. Um, Here I am showing you the yeast. It's just active yeast. And so active yeast is just dried out yeast that when it comes into contact with water and sugar, it's going to react and start bubbling up. All right, and the quality of water is a thing as well. So I'm using bottled water here. Um, and I'm trying, this is kind of funny, I'm trying to get my Kindle to work. So technology isn't always my friend. I don't know what's going on here. I'm pushing buttons. It's not showing me. I'm trying to look at the recipe. Finally. All right. Just want to make sure that I've got the right amount of water. All right, so I'm using bottled water, pure water. I mean, kitchen tap water is fine too, but I'm using this special water. And I'm going to be mixing all these things up. So I've been baking bread for about 10 years, so a while. I still make mistakes. I still have loaves that I'm not crazy about. It's a process. It's a learning process. It's like a hobby, and a lot of people are baking bread these days. It's kind of a thing. I think I go on Instagram and there's just tons of people baking beautiful bread all the time. But I started baking bread for health reasons. I felt that it was healthier to make my own bread. I knew what was in the bread. And it's kind of it's an interesting thing to think about, but pretty much everything around you has a backstory, has a history to it. Whether it's the food you eat or the furniture you're sitting on or the device you're using to watch this video, um, everything kind of has a history to it. And this was sort of my way of looking into the history of bread and where bread comes from. We've been eating bread for thousands of years. Bread is all over the Bible, and people have been growing grains and making bread or bread similar things for a very, very, very long time. And so that really interested me. And I was like, well, I want to learn how bread is made, and I want to even grow my own wheat and make my own flour and make bread from that. And to me, that was kind of an exciting thing in a way of kind of connecting me to this long history of food, a long history of a tradition of bread baking. Um, and so when I'm baking bread, sometimes I'll think about these things. Or when I'm checking on the wheat or I'm harvesting the wheat, it's kind of a fun thing to think about. Like, hey, I'm doing this thing that has been done for a very, very long time. But we don't do it so much anymore, and it's kind of a removed thing. Like you ask somebody where bread comes from, and bread comes from the store, or bread comes from a bakery. But bread comes from this plant, and that's kind of a neat thing. So I definitely encourage you to kind of think about that if you're in the baking, if you're interested in baking or interested in cooking at all. You know, cooking is such a historical thing and a traditional thing. There's a lot of really cool resources out there. So what you actually see me doing right now is I'm adding more water to this. This ends up actually being a problem in this specific situation. I'm looking for a specific consistency, and I'm not getting it. I want this poolish to be really watery. It's not like the final dough. I want it to be kind of almost not soupy, but uh, not more watery than actual dough. So I'm mixing all this together, and I'm noticing, hey, this isn't where I want it to be. I'm going to add some more water. So water and flour mix together to make dough. Different types of flour interact differently with water. Some can absorb more water, some absorb less water, and that is kind of a problem when you're trying to make a loaf of bread from a recipe, because the recipe is going to say you need this much flour and this much water. Well, that's not always the case, because you don't know, Mr. Recipe, what kind of flour I'm using. You know, maybe I'm using a flour that needs a lot of water, or maybe I'm using a flour that doesn't need a lot of water. So if you bake a lot of bread, you'll start to notice the kind of consistency of the dough that you like. And so that takes some process. You have to be willing to make mistakes. So if you bake a loaf of bread and you hate it, and you really hate the bread, throw it away. It kind of feels bad, but throw it away and just get rid of it. Oh yeah, and here I am trying to do the saran wrap, but I can't figure it out either. So finally get it off, and I'm putting the top. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to set this up so that it sits overnight. I'm setting this saran wrap on top of the bowl. You can cover it with a rag. It's not that big of a deal. Maybe in Tucson, you may need to do some things to stop it from drying out. Like if you put a rag on top of it, then put a wet towel on top of that, just to keep humidity and water sort of around it. Sometimes in Alaska, things will dry out, and I'll have to put something wet around it so that it doesn't dry out, because we get really, really dry air, especially in the winter time. Winter baking is a whole different thing, but we can go over that when you come visit in the winter time. All right, so I'm putting this together, and I'm gonna set it aside and go sit with Kim in the living room, because it's the evening time. And remember, it's the night before I'm gonna bake bread. And so this is just a pre-step in getting that ready. This is what it looks like. I took 2 pictures, one when I put it away. This is the second one. It didn't change all that much. You can see a few bubbles in the bottom. Okay, now here's the consistency that it looks like in the morning. It's really soupy, really sticky. I can stretch a lot. I decided with this bread, I'm going to put some walnuts in it. Now, putting nuts into bread is a great idea. I usually like to cut them up. It's also a really good idea, bam, they're done, is to toast them. That can also be really good. Okay, so here I am ready to mix up my final bread. Now, if you notice, I'm using a different flour now. I've used whole wheat flour for the first half. For the second half, I'm going to use white all-purpose flour. And you can play with how much whole wheat you put into your bread. You can put in 25%, 20%, 75%. I've made bread that's completely whole wheat that's been delicious. I've made bread that's only a slightly amount whole wheat, and it's still delicious. Whole wheat bread's good for you. It's good for your intestines. It's good for, it has more nutrients, stuff like that. And that's kind of, you know, an important thing to me. Okay, so here I am adding salt. Big thing here, don't ever skip the salt. It's a weird thing. It's not a whole lot of salt, but if you don't put salt in, it makes your bread really mealy tasting and kind of nasty tasting, and it's not very good. So I definitely recommend not skipping the salt. Sometimes when I was first baking, I'd take the bread out and I'd be all excited, and I'd cut it up and I'd taste it, and it would taste terrible. And it was because I had forgotten the salt. So be careful with that. All right, so now I'm going to put in some more yeast. Yeast goes in, and everything is ready to be mixed. So I'm going to add a little bit more whole wheat flour, it looks like. With the flour, you know, it's up to you. Experiment with it. Um, I'm noticing already with this dough that I'm working with, I'm getting my hands in. This is usually I use one hand to hold the bowl and one hand to mix. I'm noticing that it is super wet, and I'm going to have to add more flour. So if you remember, I added water earlier in the video, and that was a mistake. And now I'm having to fix that by adding flour because I'm not getting that consistent dough that I was looking for. So I'm mixing it up. I'm mixing it up. I'm going to continue to do that until I get that consistency, and then I'm going to set it down. This is an out of focus picture, but I'm going to leave it in here. And I'm going to let this now raise. All right, so we're letting this bread rise, and let's see here. All right, now we're cutting to the next stage. All right, the dough is ready to be shaped, and what I do is I take some flour. You can do this on a counter, you can do it on a cutting board or whatever. Is just put a little bit of this flour on the counter. This makes it so the dough won't stick to the counter. And this dough that I'm working with today in this video is very wet. It's a very wet dough, so it would stick to anything. All right, looks good. I'm gonna use this tool. Like, these aren't my normal tools. And I'm going to get this dough out of here. It's sticking to the bowl. It is a super sticky dough. So I'm trying to get it out of the bowl and onto the counter. And there it kind of comes out as a big blob. Now, I want you to know this is enough dough for 2 loaves of bread. This isn't 1 loaf of bread. So this is a recipe that makes 2 loaves of bread. Usually when I do that, I'll give 1 loaf away. I'll keep 1 loaf for Kim and I. It's a great thing. Okay, so here we are. I've got the dough out onto the counter, and I'm ready to start shaping it into loaves. I'm going to need to cut this in half. And what I'm doing is I'm tapping it, I'm checking on the sort of the stickiness of it. I'm sort of getting myself, okay, what am I gonna need to do to this dough to get it ready for the next stage? And so I'm kind of feeling it around, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna use this gigantic tool, which is for a grill, and which is not normal, use this tool to cut this dough in half. All right, so I'm going across there, and I'm going to just sprinkle some flour to make it easy, and I'm going to cut this dough in half. And I'm going to pull one piece of dough away from the other because they'll stick to each other. And I'm going to throw one to the side, just like that, and I'm going to take the dough in the other one, and I'm going to start working on it. And now what am I doing here? I'm adding more flour to the dough. It's still sticky. I really messed up. I added way too much water to this dough. But I'm like, okay, I can work with this. I'm going to try my best and get this bread made. So I'm making it into shapes. You don't really knead the dough, at least in this recipe. It's not really like a bunch of kneading. If you want to knead the dough, you can, but it's not really necessary for this loaf of bread. All right, so I'm kind of shaking it around. What I'm doing is I'm trying to get it so that it's not so sticky. So I'm throwing some more flour, I'm getting some flour on it, I'm getting some flour on my hands on the counter, and I'm trying to reduce the amount of stickiness in that dough. And I'm getting there. It's making progress, but it's not exactly where I want it to be. Okay, so that is 1 loaf of bread. Now that type of bread is called a boule, B-O-U-L-E. This next type of bread, I'm going to put it into a loaf pan and make like a loaf of bread. All right, so I'm doing the same thing. I'm trying to reduce the stickiness of it. I'm trying to get it so that it's not going to stick to the pan, because this bread's going to go into a pan. And so we'll see. All right, so how are you doing? You doing good? How's school? Nice. Really hope we can come visit sometime. We're going to be 4 then, probably, when we come and visit. But things are going good here in Anchorage. We had a bear scare. Super exciting. We ran into a black bear on a trail, and we went away from it, and we went to this other part of the trail. I went to a garden, and it followed us. And wow, my heart was just beating out of my chest. It was crazy. All right. So I'm now adding some olive oil to the pan so the bread doesn't stick. So just a little bit of olive oil. And I'm going to spread that around the pan, because otherwise sometimes the bread will stick to the pan, and that is not fun. That is super upsetting, and you have to destroy the bread basically to get it to come out. So here I'm putting the bread into the pan, and I'm putting it in the oven. Nope, I'm not going to put it in the oven yet. It's got to rise one more time, but just for about an hour. So it's not a very long rise. So I'm going to take these breads and I'm going to put them over here on this cookie sheet with a piece of parchment paper. Parchment paper is only for the boule, only for that piece. That's all you need the parchment paper for. You don't want to bake directly on the metal. All right, so I'm trying to reshape it a little bit more, and you'll see its shape really change here in just a second. So I'm going to bring the other loaf over, and I'm going to cover them. And I'm going to let them sit for about an hour. We're fast forwarding an hour. And boom. Look at the bread on the right. It really flattened out like a pancake. Oh man, too much water in this dough. All right, so I'm going to try to reshape it again. Trying to get it off of that paper because it's super sticky. It's falling all over the place. All right, so I've kind of reshaped it a little bit. I'm going to put a dusting of flour on the top, and then I'm going to do something called scoring. Scoring can be done with a razor blade. It's the best thing to use for scoring. I'm using a knife because I don't have a razor blade. I'm just doing a big cut down the middle, and I'm going to turn it and do another cut. I should have just left it at that, but I do another cut across. And this is to allow it so that when it rises, it kind of blooms, what's called a bloom, and you want your bread to bloom. And so I do it on this loaf too. Now I want you to notice this loaf of bread when it comes out of the oven. I didn't score it enough, and it kind of bloomed out of the side a little bit. All right, so the oven is preheated. It's ready to go. I'm getting my towel so I don't burn my hand. And into the oven it goes. All right. And making sure it goes in right and closing the oven. And that's it. All right, so I'm setting a timer. You always want to set a timer. You don't want to just walk away from things. And we're going to fast forward here and zoom. All right, so here I am taking the bread out after the appropriate amount of time. All right, so we got 2 big loaves of bread. Look at how much they grew. All right, so that bloom, what's called a bloom, is due to the yeast getting super excited as things warm up and then all of a sudden dying when things get too hot. And that's why it doesn't just keep blooming. It blooms to a certain part and then it just stops. And that's what we're looking for in a good loaf of bread. So we got another view here. See how it kind of came out of the side on that loaf? Yeah, didn't quite do right, but that's okay. All right, so a couple good loaves of bread. All right, so that's basically the end of the video. But I wanted to show you this one last part, which is the best part, and that's when you share the bread at meal. So here's Kim and I sitting down to a nice loaf of bread, like nice meal. There's things other than bread. We have pasta, so this is carbs on carbs. And we got some bread there. We're talking about our day. Oh, she had a good day. I had a really good day. How's your day? Oh, yeah, that's really cool. Oh, really? Oh, yeah, I baked a loaf of bread. Oh, that's cool. Oh, yeah, all right, and then we're gonna pray. So we have our prayer before our meal, and then I'm gonna offer some bread to Kim, and she's I'm so excited! I can't wait to have some bread. Oh, here we go. See, I immediately pull the bread to my side. Yummy, yummy, yummy. Ah. All right, Benny. Well, this has been a really super long video, I know. Thank you for watching. And yeah, this gives me a whole different appreciation for people that make videos. It is crazy. So maybe you could film yourself doing something that you do, one of your hobbies, and send me a video sometime. All right. Well, we'll see you soon and take care. All right. Bye.